January 17, 1944, somewhere over the frost-covered fields of northern France. The morning sky stretched gray and infinite, a canvas of churning clouds that seemed to press down upon the earth itself. At 23,000 feet, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann felt the cold seeping through his fleece-lined jacket, numbing his fingers even inside his leather gloves. Below him, the patchwork of occupied Europe unfolded like a map drawn in snow and shadow. He had flown this route 17 times before, escorting bombers back from raids over England, watching the contrails of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 streak across the winter sky like chalk marks on slate. The war had become routine, almost mechanical in its rhythms. But on this morning, as he scanned the horizon through his canopy, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, though he could not yet name what it anticipated. Then he saw them. They emerged from the clouds like a school of monstrous fish breaking the surface of the sea. American fighters, but not the sleek, nimble P-51 Mustangs or the twin-boomed P-38 Lightnings he had learned to respect and fear. These were different, massive, barrel-bodied aircraft that seemed too large, too heavy to maneuver with any grace. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. The Americans called them Jugs, short for Juggernaut, and Hoffmann understood why. They looked like flying tanks, all radial engine and armored bulk. But it was not their size that made his breath catch in his throat that morning. It was what hung beneath their wings. Rockets. 8 of them, suspended in clusters, protruding from the underwing rails like the stubby fingers of some mechanical hand. Hoffmann had seen rockets before, German Nebelwerfers that shrieked across battlefields, Soviet Katyushas that terrified infantry with their apocalyptic wail. But never had he seen them mounted on a fighter aircraft. Never had he imagined that the Americans, with their bottomless factories and their genius for industrial excess, would think to arm their already formidable fighters with weapons designed to destroy fortifications and armor. He keyed his radio, his voice tight with something between disbelief and dread. Achtung, Achtung. American fighters bearing 270, they are carrying rockets. I repeat, they are carrying rockets. The static that answered him carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. To understand the shock that rippled through the Luftwaffe that winter morning, one must first understand what the German air crews had come to expect from the air war over Europe. By early 1944, the strategic balance had already begun to shift, though many German pilots refused to acknowledge it. The invincibility that had carried the Luftwaffe across Poland, France, and into the skies over Britain had been tempered by 2 years of brutal attrition on the Eastern Front, and the relentless daylight bombing campaign mounted by the United States Army Air Forces. German pilots were no longer the hunters. Increasingly, they were the hunted. The introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943 had marked a turning point in the air war. Designed by Alexander Kartveli and powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter that had come before it. It weighed over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was not designed to dance. It was designed to survive, to absorb punishment that would shred lighter aircraft, and to deliver overwhelming firepower. 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, gave it a broadside that could saw a bomber in half or shred a fighter to confetti in seconds. But the machine guns were only the beginning. The American doctrine of strategic bombing required not just the destruction of enemy industry, but the suppression of enemy defenses. This meant attacking not only aircraft in the air, but also the infrastructure that supported them on the ground. Airfields, hangars, fuel depots, radar installations, locomotives, and supply trucks. The bombers could strike factories, but the fighters needed a weapon that could reach down and tear apart the sinews of the German war machine at ground level. The answer came in the form of the M8 high-velocity aircraft rocket, a 4.5-inch projectile packed with nearly 5 pounds of high explosive. It was not accurate by the standards of a bomb or an artillery shell, but it did not need to be. Fired in salvos, rockets could saturate a target area, turning an airfield into a crater-pocked wasteland or a convoy into a graveyard of twisted steel. The first P-47 units to receive rocket armament in late 1943 treated the weapons with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The rockets added weight, drag, and complexity. They required new tactics, new training, and a willingness to dive into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where the risk of ground fire was highest. But the pilots who mastered the rockets quickly discovered their terrible effectiveness. In the hands of a skilled pilot, a rocket-armed Thunderbolt became something more than a fighter. It became an instrument of annihilation. For the Germans, who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of air-to-air combat, the sight of rockets on American fighters represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the threat. It was not simply that the Americans had added another weapon to their arsenal. It was that they had demonstrated, once again, their ability to produce, innovate, and deploy new systems at a scale and speed that the Third Reich could not match. Every rocket hanging beneath a P-47 wing was a reminder that behind the American lines stretched an industrial empire of a kind the world had never seen. An empire that could afford to experiment, to fail, and to try again until it got the formula right. Werner Hoffmann Dove. The decision was instinctive, born of training and the desperate calculus of survival. He rolled his Messerschmitt inverted and pulled the stick back, sending the aircraft into a screaming dive that pressed him into his seat with crushing force. Around him, the sky erupted into chaos. The P-47s, detecting the German fighters, broke formation and scattered, each pilot seeking altitude, speed, and position. Hoffmann had a fleeting glimpse of one Thunderbolt rolling onto its back and diving after a Focke-Wulf 190 that had made the mistake of trying to engage. The American pilot did not fire his machine guns. Instead, he steadied his aircraft, adjusted his aim, and triggered his rockets. The projectiles leapt from their rails in pairs, trailing smoke and fire. They did not fly in a straight line. They wobbled, arcing slightly as they accelerated, their stabilizing fins chattering in the slipstream. But there were 8 of them, and they covered the sky like a spreading net. The Focke-Wulf pilot saw them coming and tried to brake, but he was too slow, too close, and the geometry of death was against him. 2 of the rockets missed, flashing past his wingtip and vanishing into the clouds below. One struck the ground 3,000 feet beneath, detonating in a geyser of frozen earth. But the 4th rocket found its mark. It struck the Focke-Wulf just after the cockpit, and the explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The fighter did not spiral or burn. It simply disintegrated, transformed in the span of a heartbeat from a machine of war into a cloud of shrapnel and flame. Hoffmann did not see his comrade die. He was too busy trying to survive. The P-47 that had fired the rockets was already turning, its massive engine roaring as it clawed for altitude. Hoffmann pulled out of his dive at 8,000 feet, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, his aircraft shuddering with the strain. He leveled off and looked around, searching for targets, for allies, for any reference point in the swirling chaos. What he saw chilled him more than the winter cold ever could. The P-47s were not retreating. They were attacking. They came in low and fast, rolling into shallow dives that brought them down to rooftop level, their rockets streaking toward the German airfield at Irreversibly, 20 miles south of where the dogfight had begun. Hoffmann watched, horrified and helpless, as the rockets slammed into hangars, fuel trucks, and parked aircraft. Each impact sent up a column of smoke and fire, and within minutes the airfield was obscured beneath a pall of black smoke. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with flak, but the P-47 seemed to ignore it. They bored in through the storm of shrapnel, fired their rockets, and pulled up in steep, climbing turns that carried them back into the safety of altitude. One Thunderbolt took a direct hit from an 88mm shell and fell, trailing smoke and pieces of wing, but the others pressed on. Was nothing he could do for the men below. As he flew eastward, back toward the relative safety of German-held territory, he found himself thinking not about the rockets or the destruction they had caused, but about the men who had fired them. Who were they, these American pilots who flew aircraft that weighed as much as a small truck, who carried enough ammunition and ordnance to level a city block, who attacked with a cold, methodical precision that left no room for chivalry or mercy? What kind of nation produced such men and such machines? He did not yet know the answer, but he suspected, with a growing sense of dread, that the answer would determine the outcome of the war. The German expectation of air combat had been shaped by the experiences of the First World War and the early triumphs of the Second. Luftwaffe pilots were trained in the traditions of the Jagdflieger, the hunter pilots who had dueled in the skies over the Western Front a generation earlier. Air combat was a test of skill, courage, and individual prowess. The best pilots, the aces, were celebrated as knights of the air, their victories tallied and their names immortalized in propaganda. Even as the war dragged on and the losses mounted, this romantic vision persisted. The Luftwaffe pilot saw himself as a warrior, not a cog in a machine. The Americans had a different vision. To the United States Army Air Forces, air combat was a problem of logistics, engineering, and industrial production. The goal was not to produce individual heroes but to produce results, and results were measured in tons of bombs dropped, miles of railroad destroyed, and enemy aircraft eliminated. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied this philosophy. It was not the most elegant fighter ever built. It was not the fastest or the most maneuverable, but it was robust, reliable, and capable of fulfilling a wide range of missions. It could escort bombers at high altitude, strafe ground targets at low level, and carry a payload of bombs and rockets that rivaled many light bombers. It was, in the words of one historian, a flying Swiss Army knife, and the Germans had no answer to it. The addition of rocket armament to the P-47 in late 1943 was the culmination of months of experimentation and development. The M8 rocket had been adapted from a design originally intended for ground-based launchers, and the process of integrating it onto a fighter aircraft required solving a host of technical challenges. The rockets had to be mounted in a way that did not interfere with the aircraft's aerodynamics or center of gravity. They had to be fired in a sequence that prevented the blast from one rocket from damaging its neighbors. And the pilots had to be trained to use them effectively, which meant learning to judge distance, angle, and airspeed while diving toward a target at speeds that could exceed 400 miles per hour. The first combat trials were conducted in the autumn of 1943, and the results were mixed. Some pilots loved the rockets, praising their destructive power and the psychological impact they had on enemy ground forces. Others complained about the added weight and drag, which reduced the P-47's already modest climb rate and made it harder to maneuver in a dogfight. But as tactics evolved and experience accumulated, the rocket-armed Thunderbolt proved its worth. By the beginning of 1944, rocket attacks had become a standard part of the American fighter-bomber repertoire, and the sight of P-47s laden with rockets became a harbinger of destruction across occupied Europe. For the Luftwaffe, the appearance of these weapons was both a tactical and a psychological blow. Tactically, the rockets extended the reach of American air power, allowing fighters to strike targets that had previously been the exclusive domain of bombers. Airfields, rail yards, and convoys that had once been relatively safe from fighter attack were now vulnerable to devastating rocket salvos. Psychologically, the rockets were a reminder of American material superiority. Every rocket fired represented steel, explosives, and fuel that the Germans could not replace. Every Thunderbolt that returned from a mission represented a pilot who would fly again, protected by armor and sustained by a supply chain that stretched unbroken across the Atlantic. The Germans had skill and courage, but the Americans had abundance. And in the calculus of total war, abundance was proving to be the decisive factor. The winter of 1944 was a season of reckoning. Across Europe, the German military machine that had once seemed invincible was beginning to crack under the weight of its own overextension. In the east, the Red Army was driving westward, liberating the borders of the Reich itself. In the south, the Allies had established a foothold in Italy, grinding their way up the peninsula against fierce resistance. And in the west, the Americans and British were massing forces for the invasion that everyone knew was coming, though no one knew exactly when or where it would strike. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across multiple fronts, was bleeding pilots and aircraft at a rate that could not be sustained. The introduction of rocket-armed P-47s was simply one more twist of the knife. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, recognized the danger immediately. In a report submitted to Hermann Göring in February 1944, Galland warned that the American fighter bombers, armed with bombs and rockets, were systematically destroying the infrastructure that the Luftwaffe depended on. Airfields were being cratered, repair depots were being burned, and fuel convoys were being ambushed. Even when German fighters managed to intercept the American raids, they found themselves at a disadvantage. The P-47s could fight their way in, deliver their ordnance and fight their way out, and there were always more of them. Galland pleaded for more aircraft, more pilots, and more fuel, but the resources simply did not exist. The German economy, strained by years of war, could not match the output of American factories, and no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for the growing disparity in material strength. The pilots in the cockpits felt this disparity in visceral, immediate ways. They flew aircraft that were older, less reliable, and more difficult to maintain than their American counterparts. They operated from airfields that were under constant attack, where the runways were pocked with craters and the hangars were burned-out shells. They took off on missions knowing that there might not be enough fuel for them to return, and that even if they survived the mission, they might be shot down by American fighters on the approach to their own base. They saw their friends die, one by one, and they knew that the replacements who came to fill the empty bunks were younger, less experienced, and less likely to survive their first 10 missions. The war had become a war of attrition, and the Luftwaffe was losing. And yet they flew. They flew because they were ordered to, because they believed in their duty, and because, for many, the idea of surrender was unthinkable. But the confidence that had carried them through the early years of the war was gone, replaced by a grim determination to survive one more day, one more mission, one more encounter with the silver-painted thunderbolts that prowled the skies like predators. March 8, 1944. The P-47s came again. This time, the target was the rail yards at Hamm, a critical junction in the German transportation network. The attack was part of Operation Argument, the coordinated Allied campaign to cripple German aircraft production and the infrastructure that supported it. More than 200 Thunderbolts participated, half of them armed with rockets. They swept in from the west at dawn, the rising sun behind them, and caught the German defenders off guard. The rockets began to fall like rain, each one trailing a plume of smoke and fire, each one detonating with a blast that shook the ground and sent shrapnel screaming through the air. Locomotives exploded, their boilers rupturing in geysers of steam. Boxcars were blown apart, their contents spilled across the tracks. Signal towers collapsed, and the rails themselves were torn from their beds, twisted into useless shapes by the force of the explosions. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters to intercept, but by the time they arrived, the damage was done. The rail yard was a ruin, and the P-47s were already climbing back to altitude, their pilots checking their fuel gauges and scanning the sky for threats. A handful of German fighters attempted to engage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Thunderbolts, freed of their rocket loads, were faster and more maneuverable, and their 8 machine guns gave them a weight of fire that no German fighter could match. The dogfight was brief and brutal, and when it was over, 4 Messerschmitts had been shot down and the rest had scattered, low on fuel and out of ammunition. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself again and again. The P-47 struck rail lines, bridges, supply depots, and airfields, their rockets tearing apart the infrastructure that the German war machine depended on. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, dispersing their aircraft to smaller, harder-to-find. For the German pilots who survived these encounters, the experience was transformative. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of German technology, training, and fighting spirit. They had been told that the Americans were soft, undisciplined, and dependent on their material advantages. But what they encountered in the skies over Europe was something different. The Americans were not soft. They were methodical, professional, and relentless. They did not rely on individual heroics. They relied on coordination, firepower, and the certain knowledge that they had the resources to keep fighting until the enemy was destroyed. The rockets were not just weapons. They were a statement of intent, a declaration that the United States would bring to bear every ounce of its industrial might to achieve victory, and that no amount of courage or skill could stand against the tide of American production. The rocket, as an object, became a symbol that haunted the German air crews. In their debriefings, in their letters home, in their whispered conversations in the barracks, the rockets appeared again and again. They spoke of the smoke trails that arced across the sky, the flashes of light as the warheads detonated, the shockwaves that could flip an aircraft or shatter a building. They spoke of the sound, a shrieking wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that announced death with mechanical indifference. And they spoke of the fear, the gnawing, corrosive fear that came from knowing that there was no defense, no counter, no way to fight back against a weapon that struck from above with such speed and violence. The rocket was the embodiment of American abundance. It was a weapon that could only exist in a nation with the industrial capacity to produce millions of tons of steel, aluminum, and high explosives, and the logistical capability to transport those materials across an ocean and deliver them to the front lines in a steady, unbroken stream. It was a weapon that required a level of coordination and planning that the Germans, for all their vaunted efficiency, could no longer achieve. And it was a weapon that represented a different philosophy of war, one in which victory was measured not by the valor of individual warriors, but by the ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outlast the enemy. In this sense, the rocket-armed P-47 was more than just an aircraft. It was a messenger, carrying a message that the Germans were only beginning to understand. The message was simple and terrible. The war was already lost. It might take months or even years for the final collapse to come, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans had the resources, the technology, and the will to grind the Third Reich into dust, and nothing the Luftwaffe could do would change that fundamental reality. The summer of 1944 brought the Allied invasion of Normandy, and with it, the final collapse of German air power in the West. The P-47 Thunderbolts, now operating from forward airfields in France, ranged across the battlefield with impunity, their rockets striking German armor, artillery, and troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe, outnumbered and outclassed, could do little but watch as the sky above the battlefield filled with American aircraft. The German soldiers on the ground came to dread the sound of the Thunderbolt's engine, a deep, throbbing roar that announced the arrival of destruction. They called the aircraft Jabos, short for Jag bomber, hunter bombers, and they learned to dive for cover at the first sign of their approach. The psychological impact of the rocket attacks on German morale cannot be overstated. For the soldiers who survived them, the experience was shattering. They had been told that the Luftwaffe would protect them, that German air superiority would shield them from Allied air power. But the Luftwaffe was gone, driven from the skies by losses it could not replace, and the soldiers were left exposed and vulnerable. The rockets came without warning, striking with a violence that left no time for thought or reaction. Men who had endured artillery barrages and tank attacks found themselves paralyzed by fear when the rockets fell, and the knowledge that there was no shelter, no escape, and no help coming eroded their will to fight. By the autumn of 1944, the war in the West had become a rout. The German armies were in full retreat, harried at every step by Allied air power. The P-47s followed them, their rockets turning every road into a killing ground, every bridge into a... In the final months of the war, as the Third Reich disintegrated and the Red Army closed in from the east, some German pilots chose to defect, flying their aircraft to Allied airfields and surrendering. Others fought to the end, dying in the wreckage of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, consumed by the same flames that their bombs and rockets had once kindled in the cities of Europe. A few survived, captured by advancing Allied forces or liberated from POW camps after the surrender. In the years that followed, as they returned to a shattered homeland and tried to rebuild their lives, they carried with them the memory of what they had seen in the skies over Europe. They remembered the Thunderbolts, the massive, relentless machines that had filled the sky with fire and smoke. They remembered the rockets, the weapons that had torn apart their airfields and shattered their confidence. And they remembered the realization, slow and bitter, that they had been fighting a nation whose power was so vast, so overwhelming, that resistance was not just futile but incomprehensible. Werner Hoffmann, the pilot who had seen the rocket-armed P-47s on that winter morning in 1944, survived the war. He was shot down over Belgium in September 1944, belayed out, and was captured by American troops. He spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England, and after his release, he returned to Germany and became a schoolteacher. In interviews conducted decades later, he spoke with quiet sadness about the war, about the friends he had lost, and about the moment when he first saw the rockets. He said that it was then, in that instant, that he understood the war was over, though it would take another year of dying for the truth to be acknowledged. "We were brave," he said, his voice soft and distant, as if speaking from across a great chasm of time. "We were skilled, but we were fighting an enemy who did not need to be brave or skilled. They had everything. They had machines that could carry more, fly farther, hit harder. They had pilots who flew not because they loved flying, but because it was a job, a task to be completed. And they had rockets, those damned rockets. Every time I saw them, I thought of all the factories in America, all the workers, all the steel and fire and noise. I thought of a nation that could afford to put rockets on a fighter aircraft, as if rockets were nothing, as if they could be thrown away like bullets. And I knew we had lost, not because we were cowards or fools, but because we had chosen to fight a giant, and the giant had awakened." The story of the rocket-armed P-47 Thunderbolt is not simply a story of technological innovation or tactical adaptation. It is a story about the nature of total war, and the ways in which industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and national will can combine to produce a force that cannot be resisted by courage or skill alone. The rockets themselves were crude weapons by modern standards, inaccurate and prone to malfunction. But they did not need to be perfect. They only needed to work well enough and to exist in sufficient numbers to achieve their purpose. And they did. The German air crews who faced them were among the most experienced and capable pilots in the world. They flew aircraft that were, in many respects, the equal of anything the Allies could field. But experience and capability were not enough. The war was decided not in the sky, but in the factories and shipyards and training fields of the United States, where an entire nation mobilized to produce the instruments of victory on a scale that the world had never seen. The rockets were a product of that mobilization, a symbol of a nation that could afford to experiment, to innovate, and to deploy new weapons faster than its enemies could adapt. In the end, the shock that German air crews felt when they saw the P-47s armed with rockets was not simply the shock of encountering a new weapon. It was the shock of confronting a truth that shattered their understanding of the war and their place in it. They had believed that determination, skill, and the righteousness of their cause would be enough to secure victory. But the rockets told a different story. They told a story of a war in which such qualities were irrelevant, in which the outcome was determined not by individual heroism, but by the ability of nations to marshal resources, organize labor, and sustain a war effort over years of unimaginable destruction. It was a new kind of war, and the Germans, for all their early successes, were not prepared for it. The rockets fell, and the Third Reich fell with them, consumed by the same fires it had once spread across the world. And in the skies above, the Thunderbolts flew on, their engines roaring, their wings laden with the instruments of annihilation, a testament to the power of a nation that had chosen to fight, and to the terrible price of challenging such power. The rockets were not just weapons, they were a message, written in fire and smoke across the sky, a message that said, "This is what abundance looks like. This is what freedom can build, and this is why you cannot